impacted today that will shape our future tomorrow. Hosted by Brianna Sagdahl, the editor of Dakota Leader, a policy news publication focused on a transpartisan approach to illustrating the tones of gray in an increasingly black and white world. Found at www.dakotaleader.com, the Dakota Leader is home to political orphans and those brave enough to question partisan rhetoric in an attempt to find common ground regarding the world of South Dakota's policies and political dynamics impacting your kitchen table. Today we review the headlines and highlights from the week. This show is made possible by our member donations and Washington Crossing, Sioux Falls' premier retirement community, Big Splash Dunk Tanks for all your party needs, Mick Baruth of Baruth Financial Services, Mike Clark Show Pigs and Buller Farrier Services. Find us online at dakotaleader.com to learn more.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dakota Leader Radio Show. I'm your host and the editor of the Dakota Leader, Brianna Sagdahl, and I'm joining you today at my kitchen table to talk about the topics that are impacting your kitchen table. I have a really special guest with me today, and I'm very excited to bring him on. Senator-elect Tom Pischke is the new senator for the Dell Rapids area. I'm super excited to discuss this week in review. We had a very interesting week, as always, in South Dakota politics. And last week there was a meeting held on Friday at the Capitol, and Tom's going to come on and help me to describe the meeting, and we're going to discuss that a little bit. Tom, thank you so much for being here with me. How are you this morning?
Hey, Brianna, I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for having me on the show. Yeah, I'm doing well, and we're just enjoying life here in Dell Rapids.
Awesome. It's a little bit cold today here in South Dakota. It seems like the weather's changing a little bit. We're getting ready for the winter. How are you guys doing with that?
Well, it's starting to change a little bit. I don't know. You know, I was outside yesterday, and it still felt plenty like summer with the humidity, and it was above 90. But yeah, you know, the nights are starting to get a little bit cooler, and it's a little bit rainy today. So, you know, September can be one of those months where you start to feel the changes, and you know, the days are definitely getting shorter now. And so there's all that happening here soon. So yeah, the weather is exciting, right? It's always changing here in South Dakota.
Yeah, I was excited to put my my seat warmers on today. Like, ooh, I love the fall. It is my absolute favorite time of season. So
there you go.
Yeah. So last Friday at the Capitol, you and your fellow colleagues hosted a meeting between county auditors and the public to sort of find common ground and try to come up with some solutions and also find some barriers, as I understand it, to particular records or data that individuals are trying to get a hold of in an attempt to do a post-audit election and also clear up some of the voter roll, as I understand. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I'd describe the meeting as more or less just trying to understand what's going on and get some communication going back and forth between the public, you know, South Dakota Canvassing Group, led by Jessica Poloma and Rick Reibel, get them in the same room with Secretary of State and with the auditors around the state, and just try to clear up some of this misinformation and this confusion that's going on. You know, I had heard at one point that South Dakota is one of 4 states that doesn't have post-election audits. That's a concern for me. And so I just think that that was the start of a conversation, I kind of felt. You know, the auditors had planned to do a meeting. I think it was scheduled yesterday in Lincoln County. And sorry, I'm stealing your thunder for questions later, but okay. You know, it felt like that meeting was not open to the public. And it turns out that they did invite the public later, or at least mentioned that public was included. But we just felt like there was only going to be closed to just the elected officials, you know, the legislature and auditors. And we didn't think that was right. I mean, the elections belong to the people, and they should be, you know, transparent to the people.
Right, and that was my understanding as well, but I want to correct that record because I received a very lovely message from Sherry Lund, who is the auditor of Lincoln County, and she wanted to let us know at the Dakota Leader that the meeting was intended to be open to the public, and in fact, yesterday they live streamed it, and so I just wanted to make sure that from our end we were correcting that. And so I think I don't know that was necessarily clear to everybody previous to that, though, because I had also understood that it was potentially just going to be between lawmakers and auditors and maybe not open to the public. And so anyways, whatever happens in that process, I think it's great. The more meetings, the better, right? The more times we can get people together and have these discussions, because and again, and I stated this last week with Representative Spencer Gosh, but our perspective at the Dakota Leader is that the elections were fair, and in the Donald Trump did not, we're not challenging anything like that. Our concern is rooted in the fact that there are people in this country and in our state who don't necessarily believe that. And so we believe that it's the responsibility of the media to create transparency and restore trust in government, right? Because we need to have a transparent and free-flowing government to keep everything going, keep the trains running on time, if you will. So so it has been our perspective that whatever we can do to help illuminate rather than disenfranchise on this issue, the better. And we've certainly seen some unfortunate editorial out there that conflates particular issues. But it's interesting because, speaking of Trump, he won South Dakota pretty handily. So I think that's one thing that really caught our attention is if these individuals were truly Trump sycophants, like, it's sort of out there, why would they be asking questions about the election if they were, if that was their hero and they're trying to prove it? Just didn't make sense, right? So that got us looking, and then we certainly got very curious in this last week when certain auditors had hired some top attorneys. So that was curious for us, and we're just trying to figure out what's really going on here. So from your understanding, could you maybe break down what it is that this group is asking for? Can we just start there?
Yeah, we can try to do that. It's kind of a complicated issue, so to speak, but I think what the South Dakota Canvassing group is really looking for is, in my opinion, a post-election audit. We need to have some transparency there, just because I just think that there is a lot of either miscommunication, misunderstanding, and just mistrust with the government, and that's okay. That's okay to say that, hey, we need to do some kind of verification here. I don't think that's wrong. I mean, bringing things to light and showing how things are done and doing post-election audits should be a good thing. This should not even be a partisan issue. That we should have buy-in from the Democrats. We should have buy-in from all factions of the Republican Party on this issue. I don't understand why there want to be any type of divisiveness in this arena at all, personally. So, and you're right, South Dakota did go to Trump very easily, and so I don't think that this is a group of residents here in the state that say they're carrying their tiki torches and saying we think Trump should have won by more or anything like that. I think this is just a group of concerned citizens who have seen that that just want to see the data and just want to have a post-election audit and just want to see that there's transparency in their government. And as a elected official myself, that's one thing that I ran on. I believe in transparency. Anybody that ever sends me an email or questions me on a vote that I take, I tell them why I vote that way. And I just think that that's something that our government should stride itself on, is bringing light to things that aren't necessarily out there in the public as much. And when we have auditors in the state that are denying these FOIA requests, it gives the mentality as to what are they hiding, right? You know, especially when it comes to these cast vote records, and I'm sure we're getting there in this conversation, but you know, if you go to the ES&S website, it actually says on there that these tabulators create cast vote records.
Right.
And so, and now what we have a Secretary of State and auditors saying we don't have a cast vote record. So what's really the truth here? I mean, why are you denying these or saying that they're not created when obviously they are created? And I don't put the blame too much on the auditors. I don't think that it's their fault if they if they don't know that what their tabulators do. To me, that falls back to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State is responsible for the elections in the state of South Dakota. They need to go and figure out how the tabulators work that their auditors are using, and train them properly, and have them, you know that these cast vote records are being created by the tabulator, and be able to decrypt them if they're encrypted, you know, so the public can have this information. So
Right.
I think, you know, there was a lot of conversation around that at the meeting on Friday. And so I just hope that that was the beginning of a conversation that we can keep moving forward, and try to move South Dakota out of the darkness in this subject area.
Well, that's a really good point. And on Tuesday, I'm not sure if you're aware, but on Tuesday, there was a settlement that was reached between the ICB, the Rosebud, and Ogala. I'm sorry if I'm butchering that.
Ogala Lakota.
Thank you. Indian tribes. And
yes,
you know, in that settlement, one part of the settlement was a federal judge had ruled, you know, Lyman County needed to actively work on correcting a redistricting plan. Or no, excuse me, I apologize. Let me back up. That was actually a different case. So the ruling that happened on Tuesday was for there was an issue with registration, I believe. Anyways, you know what? Let's just do this. What I'll say is that a settlement was recently reached where the Secretary of State is being court ordered to provide more training to auditors. So I guess my point in saying this is that there are some issues across the state, and multiple groups, including the ACLU, have brought lawsuits forward or have, you know, tried to work on various issues pertaining to the election process. And I certainly would not put the ACLU in, you know, a Trump sycophant category by any means. So I think it's just a really important point that illustrates this is not a partisan issue. There are people in South Dakota who just want to have a better understanding of the process, how it works, and make sure that there's equity and equality in access to voting. And so I think you make a very good point about that transparency, and that, you know, there should be buy-in from both sides on all of these issues. And so I thank you for making that point. And I also would like to say, you know, in South Dakota, our lawmakers are some of the most easily accessible. So I want to give you praise and hats off for that. And it's not just you guys in the legislature, but our city council members and commissioners. By far, South Dakota has been one of the best states to report in. As a journalist, people pick up their phone, they actually respond to emails, and it's really great. It's a really great atmosphere here. So thank you for that. And
well, you're welcome. You know, I occasionally I do take a call from like someone out of state, like a journalist out of state, and they want to call me about a bill that I voted for abroad or whatnot. And they're sometimes a little bit surprised, like they're not getting a secretary. They're just getting right to my personal cell phone. You know, it's listed out there on the LRC website. So if you want to call me, go ahead and call me. You want to text me, go ahead and text me. Usually respond to people. So.
Yeah, that's true. That's true across the board. It's unusual, but here in South Dakota, that's absolutely the truth. Sure. So, you know, and on that note, I had watched the meeting that was hosted by county auditors yesterday, and I also had heard some very similar crossover from the meeting on Friday and then the meeting held yesterday. And what I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I am very new to this whole issue, but the cast vote record does in fact exist. It's on a thumb drive. And from what I understand is that there is an issue or a misunderstanding at this point pertaining to access. So one, I understand you need a decryption device in order to access just the data, not the pictures of the ballots, but just the data. And it takes specific software to do that. And then in addition to that, county auditors are unsure if they're allowed to release that data because from my understanding, either the Secretary of State on behalf of ES&S or somewhere down the line, they have been told that this data is proprietary information. Did I sum that up correctly? Does that sound right?
Well, I'm not an expert on this either. I'm learning just kind of as you are, but that's kind of my understanding too. But at least we have moved the conversation from cast vote records don't exist, and now we can have a conversation that they do exist, and how do we go forward with them and providing them to the public if that's at all possible, right? And so sure, I have heard that they are encrypted, that you need certain electionware to decrypt them, and so that they're readable. And so let's go move forward now, and let's have that conversation. And let's have, the Secretary of State dig in and say, what can we provide to the public? What is public information? There should be some back and forth here with ES&S and our Secretary of State, or with the auditors in this ES&S. I'm not sure which one needs to happen. But in my mind, the Secretary of State is the one person responsible for elections in the state of South Dakota. So that's where I would put the burden. So
sure.
But yeah, let's start having the conversation as to what we can do to start going forward with the post-election audit. I mean, if we're one of 4 states that doesn't do this, that means there's 46 states that do this. Let's go talk to one of our neighbors and say, hey, how does this work? Or let's talk to ES&S. How does this work? How can we provide this post-election audit information to the public?
Right. I remember in Oregon, I had covered, previous elections, and I remember watching a process where the county auditors would take a random sampling of ballots, and so they would pick at random. And then they would bring up the image, and they actually use the image in Oregon. So this is a different process than South Dakota. Of course, each state is allowed by law to create their own election process or how they handle elections. In Oregon, what they do is they bring up these sample ballots and then they match them against the machine. So each machine will keep a tabulation of the votes. And so by doing this, this is called a post-election audit, or at least this is what counts in Oregon as one. And so they'll make sure that the machine correctly recorded the vote as it says on the ballot. And so I thought that was really interesting that it doesn't happen in South Dakota, because I had asked about that. I said, oh, well, what about the random samples that they take afterwards? And that's when I found out that South Dakota is one of only 4 states that does not do this process. And so by South Dakota state law, and so this is in all fairness, right, because this is not on the auditors, this is just how the state code is at the moment. But they are, as I understand it by law, they're supposed to certify and seal it. And that seal is not allowed to be broken unless it's challenged by a court order, as I understand it. Is that right? So they can't actually look at it.
I believe that's correct. I'm not an expert on that either, and so sure. I can't confirm that, but I have heard that same thing as well. So, just to that point, though, I would say that the Secretary of State, again, is the person in charge of elections in the state, and if there needs to be a policy change within the state, please come and ask the legislature to bring a policy change. I'm certainly open to making changes to make our elections better. And if this is something that state law is prohibiting right now, or we just don't have the right language in place in state law, let's change it. Let's get that done.
Yeah,
I'm certainly open to that conversation. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's fair. And also to that point, I guess I would add that really, unless there was this awareness, the conversation wouldn't have been able to happen to begin with. So I think it is important when people bring up these issues, because anything that you can do to make the process better or make people feel more comfortable with the process doesn't necessarily challenge the process in it itself, other than, say, maybe the ACLU, who has actually sued the state. That's potentially a very different story there. But but when just bringing up these issues and asking how individuals can have more certainty or feel, more confident with the process, certainly leads to these very important conversations. As to the Secretary of State, the current Secretary of State is Steve Barnett, and he is no longer going to be the Secretary of State, as I understand it, right?
That's correct.
Okay, and so can you tell us a little bit about that process and what happened, how each party chooses their Secretary of State, and kind of what happened recently in regards to that?
Well, sure. So at the state convention, the Republican state convention, is how the Republicans choose their nomination for Secretary of State. And Steve Barnett still has another term that he was eligible to run for, but he was challenged by challenger Monet Johnson. And at the convention, the majority of the delegates in our process voted for her to be our nominee on the ballot. And so that's what kind of is the situation right now, is that Steve Barnett holds the office, but he's no longer going to be on the ballot, so he won't be eligible to be Secretary of State next term, and Monet Johnson will be. And I believe it's a pretty similar process for the Democrats as well. They have a convention where a candidate is nominated, and I don't believe that person was challenged in their convention, but yeah, that's just kind of how it works, I guess. The Secretary of State is nominated at the party's convention before the election, after the primary, but before the general.
Okay, great. So then going into this November's general, so we'll have Monet Johnson running on the Republican ticket, and I believe a gentleman named Tom Cool who's running on the Democratic ticket. And so when one of them wins, when will they take office? Do you know?
Well, I believe they take office the same time that all the legislators take office as well. So that'll be like the second Tuesday in January.
Okay.
And so that's kind of when all the legislators show up, and that's when session starts. And that's when all the new constitutional officers will also take hold of their seats as well. So.
Sure. And so there's a very short window, it would appear, between now and November to do the training ordered by court, for one, and certainly we won't see legislation between now and then to solve the post-election audit concerns. But do you think South Dakota might end up seeing some legislation come up this session for post-election audits?
Well, it's very possible. I guess I would predict that that's probably something that's going to be coming, especially I think if Monet Johnson does win that seat and beats Tom Cool. I would guess that we're going to have some legislation presented probably from her office or somebody close to her that will make some changes around there. I currently don't have anything drafted in that arena, but I'm certainly willing to listen and move forward there. Basically, I think we kind of need to see what happens here at the general election in November. And then once that is over, there's plenty of time from that time period until the session starts in January to get some legislation drafted. So I think that's kind of what I would say is kind of where we're at. We kind of just need to see who wins that race.
Mm.
So, and I'm not sure if I don't know Tom Cole personally. I've never even met the man. So I don't know if that's something that he's concerned with or not, or maybe he thinks our elections are just perfect the way they are. I'm not sure. So.
Well, we'll have to have him on air. So
I'll
most certainly reach out to him and see if he would be interested in an interview with us. We'd love to talk to him about that and see what his platform is for Secretary of State. Certainly seems to be a very important issue right now. And I think for many who are, concerned about the process, regardless of it being an issue or not, I think personally it's important that everyone come to the table and feel very good about what we have going into the future. So
absolutely. Like I talked about earlier, I mean, it's just a transparency issue. I think that we should have transparency in all areas of our government as much as we can, and it just seems like this is one of the areas that we might be lacking a little bit. So, and like I said before, I don't think it's not a partisan issue. It's just something that's good with government, is to be transparent in this arena. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I also, as I understand it, this is an important issue with the amount of initiative petitions that are coming to the ballot. So I think, for me personally, I think it was a very smart idea for the Democratic Party here in South Dakota to open their primaries to non-affiliated voters. And, this is just me talking, but, the amount of registered Democratic voters and non-affiliated voters tend to outnumber the amount of voting registered Republicans in the state. So if they can bring those two demographics together, like we recently witnessed, they can do some pretty amazing things at the ballot. And so one of those things coming up in November is Medicaid expansion. And as I understand it, the Democratic Party is really reaching across the aisle to non-affiliated voters, which could be, potentially Republican, Libertarian leaning, or maybe they just haven't decided which party they, align with most. And so Medicaid is coming to the November ballot, and so people on both sides of that issue are definitely wanting to make sure that every vote counts, right? So can you explain a little bit about the Medicaid ballot measure and what that will do here in South Dakota?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that a little bit.
Thank you.
Just to comment on your numbers of voters, I believe the number is around 290,000 Republican voters in the state of South Dakota, and if you add up the Democrats and the others, independents, I think that comes to about 300,000. So the Republicans are coming close to actually having more in numbers there. Now, but that doesn't mean that every Republican is right-leaning. There's a lot of Republicans that are in the middle on certain areas and certain issues, and that doesn't mean that every independent is going to be for Medicaid expansion or is going to be leaning left either.
Right.
In fact, I've talked to when I'm out knocking on doors and asking people for their votes for my seats. I knock on Democrat doors who definitely are going to vote for me, and they love my stances on a lot of the issues, and I'm pretty far to the right. And so, it's there's a mixed bag of everything, and sure. There's people that are, like I said, Democrats that they probably are really Republican with their values, but they just never bothered of changing. Their parents were a Democrat, and then they just decided that they need to be Democrat, and so that's just kind of what they are. So, but with that said, Medicaid expansion, state of South Dakota, obviously is on the ballot here in the upcoming general election, and I'm an advocate against Medicaid expansion. Okay. I think that my prediction is that if Medicaid expansion passes on the ballot here in November, that the state of South Dakota will have to implement an income tax within the next 5 to 7 years to pay for it. It's incentivized heavily from the federal government in the early years, so you get more and more money. But after that, those incentives fall off, and therefore, at that point in time, the state is then hooked on the idea of having more state government medical run. I'm losing my words here, but you understand what I'm saying, is that there's more incentive for the state to keep on that. And so, or the people want it because they get money from the government. And so then they kind of hook you. And so, but then the incentives from the federal government ends and the state has to pay for that. And so where do we get that money? We have to raise taxes somewhere. We already have raised our sales tax, 5 years ago, from 4% to 4.5%. And we had plenty of money this last year to lower that back down, but there was no appetite for that in the Senate or from the governor. And so, here we are. I just think that more than likely, if that passes, there's going to be more taxes because you have to pay for it somehow. And so I am not a fan of that. I think that taking more money from the people is, in a way, almost immoral. I think that the government should be limited, small, and so I don't like that when we have to take more money from the people. I think that you can spend your money better than the government can. So that's just how I live my life and how I legislate. So that's my prediction, though, if it does pass, is that we'll have more taxes in the state of South Dakota. And so, bring that back to election integrity and post-election audits, it's very important that that vote is true, right? So what we actually vote for is actually what happens there. So, I've heard from some people that they don't believe that the marijuana actually passed in 2020. They think that there might have been some fraud there. So I don't know. That's the problem. We don't have a post-election audit to find out and verify that. And so, right, I think that kind of brings it all full circle and saying as to why this process is so important, right? It's just important that we have this so that we can verify that the elections are true.
Sure, and thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Speaking of Rick Weibel, I received a phone call from him yesterday, and I was really pleasantly shocked, I would say. I have read time and again in the media here that these efforts began after the Mike Lindell symposium, or something along those lines, right? And so Rick called me and said, I feel like you're the only journalist who will report on this accurately. And it's true, this process began after the symposium, but there's something they're leaving out, which is really important. And what he said really shocked me. He found Mike Lindell or something, that he had put together to be wildly inaccurate. And so Rick's position was to actually disprove Mike Lindell. That is when he got involved, because he felt like the process was secure and he wanted to prove the guy wrong. I thought that was just so funny because, of course, that part has not been reported in the media, and it kind of tickled me because I always love hearing, the rest of the story, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I hadn't heard that's what he was trying to do either. So it's always interesting to find out how people get involved with certain things. So yeah. I mean, and to be quite honest with you, I mean, this isn't something that's really been on my radar for a long, long time either. I mean, I've always kind of just thought that, South Dakota's a pretty small state. I've been a poll worker here in my precinct and kind of watched how the election works. I've seen how our precinct leaders, match up the number of ballots that are given out to the number of people that came in and vote, and the number has to match and all these kind of things, and then when you go and you look at those results on the Secretary of State's website, that the number does match the number of people that came in and all those things. So I don't know. I mean, I think that it's some kind of proves that that's secure and whatnot. But
Sure.
anything that we can do to make it better, I think is good. And so, if there's other ideas out there that, especially with these tabulators, I don't know how these tabulators work. And so there's, people that have studied them and say that there could be some flaws there. Let's take a look at that. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I can't say that I even really understand what a tabulator is. But I was, watching the meeting yesterday, and there was a comment made that kind of made me scratch my head. And one of the comments made was something to the effect of we keep these closed so that they can't be hacked, or they can't be messed with by bad actors. It was something to that effect. I don't even know what a tabulator is. Can you explain that a little bit? You know more about that, or?
Well, I've seen them work a little bit with recounts that I've had in my races, but basically it's just this machine that the auditors, they put the ballots into, and then it kicks out a piece of paper showing what the votes were for all the races. It's my understanding of it. So it counts the ballots, counts the votes.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. Again, this is the first time I've really looked into these things myself. So, I just remember the Bush-Gore race in 2000, and that turned out to be quite the fiasco. And there was, countless hours of hand counting, and my understanding is that these companies like ES&S that are on contract with South Dakota, they tried to perfect the process so that would never happen again. So it would make sense to have something to that effect, like a tabulator, something that spits out something to make it easier to figure out in the end. So
sure.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. I really appreciate you explaining that. So going forward, it sounds like depending on the Secretary of State, we could potentially see some legislative efforts this coming session, and hopefully people will feel really confident about that process. Is there anything else happening that you might want to share with us, or any other news going on this week, or what have you got going on, Tom?
Oh, let's see here. Say that at this point in time, here we are on September 9th, and I just really think that people are just starting to concentrate on their campaigns most of the time. Here as a sitting legislator, when I first ran, I was told that people kind of wear two hats. When it's campaign season, you put on your campaign hat and you work to raise money and you work to raise votes. Those are the two things that you're concerned about. And right now, pretty much everybody has on their campaign hat, right? They're worried about winning their election. And then once the election's over and you have won, then you take off your campaigner hat and you put on your legislator hat. And so that's when you're concerned about your policy and those sort of things moving forward. So, here that now that we're after Labor Day, that's kind of when unofficially, I would say that campaigns kind of start. That's when they really kick in, because the general public really, they don't want to think about elections and politics all the time. So after Labor Day, the election is starting to near now. And so now people will start getting having more focus on it. And so do candidates too. They'll start working and they'll start putting out signs and knocking on doors and putting together their mailers and that sort of thing. So that's kind of what I would say is going on starting this week and moving forward for the next 6 weeks or up to Election Day. So
that's a really great point. So during this time, now that you've brought this up, this would probably be a really fantastic time for constituents to either get involved or maybe get in front of their potential lawmakers and ask some questions. In your experience, in your opinion, what are some of the really important questions that you've either been asked or that you feel constituents would benefit from asking of their lawmakers going into this election? Are there any really important questions or points that you can think of, or that maybe somebody's asked you that you thought was a really great question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it really all depends on what's important to you, the constituent, what's important to you, the voter. And if you're an active voter and you want some answers and you're undecided on who you're going to vote for, you should figure out who's going to be on your ballot and you should reach out to them. And the information is out there. We all have campaign finance reports and statements of organization that generally have our information out there. Our addresses are listed on the Secretary of State's website, so you can certainly go stop in at our house. So
I would have been doing that.
I have nothing to hide. Come ring my doorbell, and if you want to talk, well, let's talk. But all those things aside, I mean, find out what's important to you and find out where that person is that you might potentially be voting for or who might represent you. Find out where they are on that issue as well, or issues, I should say. And so, I've had a lot of questions asked to me when knocking on doors and out campaigning. I mean, as far as what my stances are on Medicaid expansion, what are my stances on marijuana, what are my stances on teacher pay, on taxes, the whole gamut. Obviously, where I stand on abortion. All those things have been asked of me at the door or by people calling me, right? And so it all depends on what is important to you, the voter.
And not for you by any means, but typically during campaigning season, when it comes to fundraising, would you say that those who get involved and raise funds and help support candidates to win, would you say that their issues are maybe heard a little bit more, or might have a little bit more? Does that play any role in when individuals are elected, kind of like how they create their policy, or do you see a correlation there at all? And maybe not yourself, but maybe colleagues at all?
Yeah, I mean, possibly. I don't know if I would say that. I would say that the people that support me and get behind me are generally people that align with my ideology already, right? And the people that give me money align with my ideology already. Is because I tend to not sway too far from my principles and my ideology, and so I think people have come to realize that a lot too. And so the people that kind of get behind me and give me money are the people that pretty much agree with me already and aren't asking me to sway. But there might be other colleagues that, yes, a big donor gives them money and that might sway them to be more apt to vote for their issue. That's very possible. And to be honest with you, there's probably issues that I'm not really have a strong conviction one way or another. And if someone says that they have a lot of money and they want to talk to me about it, I'm certainly open to the conversation. That's what I'm here to do, is listen to your side, and I'm also here to listen to what your opponents are going to say too. So, but I would say it's more, working with your leaders in some of your small communities, especially like my district, for example. I have a lot of small communities in my district. I don't have very much population in Sioux Falls. And so I get to know some of the people that are leaders in these small communities and find out what's important to them and try to build a relationship with them, and so that they can help me out in their community. And when a time comes that they need something at the state level, we're on a first name basis. And we have each other's phone number. They can call or text me when I'm out in session. And, you can tell me, hey, we want a bill brought for this, or we want you to vote a certain way on this. And, we can have that conversation already because we have built that relationship. And so
right. And
I just think it's very important to build those relationships.
I just want to back up a little bit, because what I have noticed is usually when there's money involved, it means that there are a lot of people who feel very strongly, especially if it's a grassroots effort or an organization like, let's just take, what is that group? It's Health Freedom South Dakota, right?
Okay.
Or South Dakota Health Freedom.
Yeah.
There's a lot of moms who, they do bake sales and they put in their $20 and they send it to that group so that group can, go through and meet all the legislators in the state assembly, and they can go through and, and give those moms, a good idea of who's going to support their kids going to school or not. It's not as big of an issue. I think their issues are not maybe as drastic here as they are maybe on the West Coast, where kids, for example, can no longer go to school unless they've had their full childhood vaccination schedule. And for some families, they can't. I've reported on this pretty extensively. Some families can't. They have genetic issues, pandas, etc. Right? There's all these different things, and and the kids can't handle it. So their doctors have told them not to, but then they're still not able to get a medical exemption for whatever reason or another. So those religious and philosophical exemptions are really important. And I know I'm going off tangentially here. My point is, and I'll bring it back in, a group like that's mainly consisted of moms who are getting together and putting that money, right, is typically indicative of a community need, a desire. And it's not necessarily always like these big bad corporations who are trying to buy votes. Or at least that's been my experience. Sometimes that happens, sure. But for the most part, what I have noticed is you get a couple $100 here, a couple $100 there. I was actually shocked when I started, reporting on policy and issues of politics. There's not as much money in politics as I really thought that there was. Anyways.
Not in South Dakota, I would say.
Right.
I think you're at the federal level. I think there's lots and lots of money. But here in South Dakota, I mean, I run my campaigns on, 20,000 or less. And so, it all comes down to buying a good pair of sneakers and knocking on doors and asking for those votes. So, but when you're talking about campaigns that are in the millions of dollars, I think that's a little bit different story. So, and you make the correlation to Health Freedom South Dakota and that group, a lot of times they'll have bills that have been brought that are important to them, and they'll get people on the record as to who supports them and who doesn't support them. So when then they have some money that they want to throw at a candidate one way or another, maybe they'll find somebody who aligns with their values that's running against somebody who's voted against them. And so that's kind of how that works. Or they'll have somebody who does support what they're doing and is being challenged by somebody who doesn't. And again, they will try to support someone that supports what they're trying to do. So I think that's kind of what it's all about. And we have different people, different entities doing exactly the same thing all over the place. Right. And so that's just kind of how it works.
And that's certainly probably not different from either the ACLU, the ICB, the tribal nations, or South Dakota canvassing this year. I would imagine that during this election, the issue of integrity and auditor training is probably going to be a fairly large question to candidates. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I think that's becoming more and more of an issue that might be asked of people. How do you align on an election integrity? Monet Johnson, for example, she's basically running her campaign and saying that's the most important issue to me is election integrity. And so, I think that when some of these people that's important to them, and a candidate knocks on their door or asks for their vote, they might ask that question as to where do you think about election integrity? Is that an important issue to you? So definitely.
You're right. I actually got one of her cards in the mail not long ago, and it said that she is a proponent or an ally, something along those lines, of a post-election audit. Sure. So I thought that was really interesting, because then of course I had to ask, well, what's a post-election audit? And that started right? So
sure.
Well, Senator Pischke, I'm so grateful for your time here today. We're going to wrap the show, and I just wanted to ask if you had any final thoughts you might want to share, and if not, then thank you so much for your time. I think this has been extremely informative.
Great. Basically, I would just say that anybody that's watching this is that you as the voter, it's important for you to get involved, and it's important to understand where the candidates are, the people that represent you, where they are on the issues. So do your due diligence, find out who's representing you, find out what they value, and find out what they're all about, and then vote accordingly.
And in South Dakota, you can literally pick up the phone and most likely get that person on the other end instead of a secretary or anybody else. Thank you so much, Tom. We're so grateful for your time. Happy Friday. I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Same to you, Brianna. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.